On the morning of Tuesday, October 19th, emergency services received a distress call. Marta was missing, her phone was off, and no one could reach her. Northamptonshire police responded swiftly. Officers were dispatched to her address on Wood Street. Officially, it was listed as a welfare check, a routine step when someone is reported missing. But even before they stepped inside, officers sensed this wasn't a routine call. The house was silent. No signs of life, no response at the door. Following standard protocol, and with Marta's family growing increasingly concerned, the police made the decision to force entry. What they found inside was deeply unsettling. In that quiet room, officers made a grim discovery. Marta was there. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Marta Chmielewski was born in 1990. She was a vibrant force, full of color, kindness, and unshakable independence. Her life left a lasting imprint on everyone she met, from childhood friends to strangers she helped without a second thought. Marta's story began in Bydgoszcz, a lively and historic city nestled in northern Poland, known for its scenic rivers, bustling markets, and close-knit neighborhoods where everyone knew each other by name. From a young age, she stood out, not because she demanded attention, but because she radiated a natural warmth that quietly drew people in. Her family, who adored her deeply, often described her as exceptional in every sense of the word. She had a spark, a kind of light that made people want to be near her. She was known for her bright smile, which seemed to appear effortlessly, and her unshakable optimism that lifted others when they were down. Whether it was helping a neighbor carry grocery up a flight of stairs, or spending an entire afternoon catching up with an old friend over coffee, Marta had a rare gift. She made people feel seen and heard. Marta's brother and sister-in-law often said she was the glue that held the family together. She never waited to be asked. She just acted. She'd show up when someone needed her, instinctively knowing how to help, whether through a kind word, a home-cooked meal, or simply her reassuring presence. She had a way of making burdens feel lighter just by being there. Back in Poland, Marta shared a particularly close bond with her parents, especially her father. Friends affectionately called her a daddy's girl, but not in a cliched or materialistic sense. Theirs was a bond rooted in quiet strength, mutual respect, and deep affection. Marta would call him just to share the little details of her day, and he would always listen intently, proud of the woman she was becoming. These daily conversations were not just habits. They were lifelines, symbols of their enduring connection even as Marta grew more independent. Her love didn't stop with her parents. Marta absolutely cherished her role as an aunt to her brother's young daughters. She poured herself into that relationship with joy and sincerity. She would often arrive with small gifts tucked into her purse. A coloring book, a soft toy, or just their favorite candy. But what mattered most was her time. She'd kneel on the floor to play board games, braid their hair, or simply listen as they told stories about their day at school. She made each child feel like they were the most important person in the world. Her family would often say that Marta had a natural gentleness, the kind of presence that made you feel safe, valued, and genuinely loved. In her mid-20s, while still living in Poland, Marta's path crossed with someone who would change her life, Paweł Chmielewski. Paweł was a few years older, with a confident air and a deep passion for cars, particularly BMWs, which he treated like prized possessions. At first glance, they seemed to complement each other perfectly. Marta, with her spirited, open-hearted nature, was drawn to Paweł's quieter confidence. Friends would later recall how well they seemed to fit together, laughing during walks, exchanging music playlists, and planning future getaways with wide-eyed enthusiasm. They bonded over shared dreams of travel, opportunity, and building something bigger than themselves. Paweł spoke often of wanting to explore life outside of Poland, and Marta, always curious and courageous, found that desire deeply appealing. The relationship moved quickly. Within a couple of years, they were ready to take a step that many couples dream of, but few approach with such determination. On July 29th, 2016, Marta and Pavel were married in a small but joyful ceremony in Bydgoszcz. The wedding reflected Marta's values, meaningful, heartfelt, and rooted in family. Surrounded by loved ones, with traditional Polish customs and a feast of local dishes, the day was filled with genuine happiness. Marta's father, beaming with pride, watched as his daughter stepped into this new chapter of life. It was a day of celebration, laughter, and hope. The newlyweds began their life together in familiar surroundings. They rented an apartment in Bydgoszcz and settled into a routine. Marta, ever the homemaker, took pride in making their space feel warm and welcoming. For a time, life seemed aligned with their vision. A stable, affectionate relationship with dreams still very much alive. But Marta and Pavel weren't content to stay still for long. They both felt the pull of opportunity beyond Poland's borders, a longing for new experiences, broader horizons, and greater financial stability. After thoughtful conversations and with the encouragement of Marta's brother, who had already relocated, they made a bold decision. In 2017, they left Poland behind and moved to England, settling in the modest but welcoming town of Kettering in Northamptonshire. The decision wasn't easy. Tearful goodbyes were exchanged at the airport. Promises were made to call every day. But Marta, true to her resilient spirit, approached the change with optimism. This wasn't just a relocation. It was the beginning of a new chapter filled with hope. Kettering, with its quiet streets, local cafes, and a growing Polish community, quickly began to feel like a second home. Marta found work and started building a new circle of friends. She embraced her new life wholeheartedly. She and Pavel spent weekends exploring their surroundings, hosting family dinners, and discovering the little joys of their adopted town. Her nieces would visit, and Marta, as always, was ready with games, treats, and stories. Social media posts from those early months painted a picture of contentment. Smiling faces, captions about adventure, and photos of cozy evenings out. On the surface, things looked good. The move had initially brought them closer. Shared challenges, finding work, adjusting to a new culture, gave them purpose and unity. Marta, known for her adaptability and warmth, made it look easy. She built friendships, thrived at her job, and kept in touch with her family back home. But as time passed, subtle but troubling changes began to emerge in her relationship with Pavel. Pavel, who had once seemed quietly confident, began displaying a more controlling side. It started with small things. Questions about where she was going, who she was seeing, or how long she'd be out. At first, Marta brushed it off, thinking it was just adjustment stress or cultural change. But the pattern deepened. His inquiries became more persistent, more pointed, and less about curiosity and more about control. Marta, who had always valued her independence, began to feel the walls closing in. She loved deeply, but she also believed in personal freedom, in the right to grow, explore, and be trusted. As Pavel's behavior shifted, Marta quietly wrestled with how to respond. She didn't want to give up on the life they were building. As the months quietly gave way to years, what had once appeared to be a passionate partnership between Marta Chmielewski and Pavel Chmielewski began to shift. Slowly, and then with unsettling speed. Pavel's protectiveness, once seen as concern, gradually turned into something more consuming. His jealousy wasn't fleeting. It grew like ivy, creeping into every corner of their shared life. Marta's social circle in Kettering's Polish community was expanding, and she was thriving, meeting new people and rediscovering her confidence. Her laughter became more frequent, her social calendar fuller. She was finally regaining the voice that had grown quiet during the more difficult stretches of her marriage. But as Marta's world expanded, Pavel's tolerance shrank. He struggled, not just with the move or with adapting to a new culture. but with Marta's independence. The more she found herself, the more he seemed to lose his sense of control. He began texting her obsessively, his tone shifting from curious to demanding. At times, he would arrive uninvited at locations where Marta was meeting friends, insisting on explanations for her whereabouts. What once might have seemed like an over-attentive spouse now carried the weight of something more alarming. A man grappling with his own inability to let go. Those closest to Marta began to see subtle yet unmistakable changes. Her spark, once unmistakable, dimmed in Pavel's presence. She would smile, yes, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Friends described her as distracted, cautious, sometimes even anxious. When they gently asked if everything was all right, Marta, ever loyal and private, would wave it off. Pavel was just under pressure, she'd say. He was adjusting. He didn't mean harm. But in private conversations with her family, Marta began to open up more candidly. She admitted that things had changed, and not for the better. Her family later revealed that she had expressed growing discomfort about Pavel's behavior. She was not afraid to speak her truth, but she was still hopeful that the situation could be resolved peacefully. Court records would later document 3 significant incidents involving Pavel. One in August 2020, another around Easter 2021, and a third in September 2021. Each instance, taken on its own, might have seemed manageable. But together they painted a pattern. One marked by tension, fear, and a woman trying to preserve her autonomy in the face of mounting pressure. Marta had always been strong-willed, resilient, bright, and capable. But by this point, she no longer recognized the man she had once married. She shared these thoughts with close friends, expressing confusion, disappointment, and yes, fear. Still, she remained, perhaps out of hope, perhaps out of a sense of duty, or perhaps because walking away from a life once built together is never as simple as it seems. But Pavel's behavior wasn't confined to their private life. He began contacting Marta's friends, pressuring them with questions about her activities, her location, her companions. It was a web of control that extended far beyond the bounds of a normal relationship. By the middle of 2020, Marta had made a critical decision. She left their shared home and moved into a place of her own. It was an act of courage, one that marked the beginning of a new chapter. In her own space, Marta began to reclaim her joy. Her social media reflected this shift. Photos of gatherings, captions about healing, and affirmations of personal strength. In one notable post, she shared a photo of herself with a quote in Polish that read, "One of the worst mistakes a person can make is wasting years of life waiting for another person to change or develop." The words were powerful. A quiet, yet bold declaration that she was ready to step into her future on her own terms. In this new chapter, Marta began seeing someone, a work colleague who offered her kindness, stability, and respect. She was not rushing, but rather rediscovering what it meant to be cared for without condition. She was also planning ahead. Her goal was to formally end her marriage, filing for divorce back in Poland where the union had been registered. She began gathering the necessary paperwork and working with lawyers in Bydgoszcz. It was not a decision she made lightly, but one rooted in her desire to close a chapter that had turned dark. Even as Marta tried to move on, Pavel continued to reach out. He texted and called frequently, attempting to re-enter her life despite her clear requests to keep their contact limited. At times, his messages were pleading, at others, accusatory. Marta, firm in her boundaries, messaged him repeatedly asking him to leave her alone. Her words calm, direct, and resolute. Her family, particularly her brother and sister-in-law who lived nearby, became increasingly concerned. Marta confided in them about the strain she was under and the steps she was taking to protect her future. They offered her unwavering support, helping her emotionally and practically, and standing beside her every step of the way. Marta also leaned on her community. Friends invited her to dinners, joined her for gym workouts, and included her in group outings. Anything to remind her of the joy and normalcy she so deeply deserved. Those around her admired her strength, not just in breaking free, but in rebuilding with grace and determination. But Pavel was not letting go. His jealousy had become something deeper, harder to ignore. Despite Marta's efforts to create distance, he remained a presence, watching, reaching out, trying to hold on to a version of their past that no longer existed. By the autumn of 2021, Marta was standing at the edge of a new life. She was talking excitedly with friends about her upcoming Christmas trip to Poland. She looked forward to reuniting with her father, reconnecting with old friends, and celebrating the season with a sense of peace she had long missed. Her energy had returned. Her eyes sparkled again. On Friday, October 15, Marta spent the evening out with friends. They laughed, exchanged stories, and took photos together. It was one of those nights that seemed ordinary in the best of ways, full of light conversation and casual joy. Marta left the gathering around 10:40 p.m., dressed in her usual stylish way, her confidence fully restored. She appeared, by all accounts, like a woman in control of her own story again. But then, something shifted. When Marta didn't arrive for work on the morning of Monday, October 18th, concern spread almost instantly among her colleagues. She wasn't the kind of person to disappear without notice. Marta was dependable to a fault, the type of team member who would often arrive before anyone else, quietly make her rounds with a kind smile, and always lend a helping hand. She was consistent, responsible, and full of life, known not only for her professionalism, but for the quiet warmth that made the workplace a better, more human place to be. So, when her usual morning check-in didn't happen, people started to worry. Calls were made, texts were sent, but no one got a response. As the hours ticked by, that worry deepened. Marta's phone continued to ring unanswered, her social media remained inactive, and none of her usual contacts, not even her close friends, had heard from her since the end of the previous week. Her brother, who was used to chatting with her regularly, began to grow uneasy. He tried again and again to reach her. Still nothing. Then came the moment that shifted worry into dread. A text message, seemingly from Marta, arrived on the family's group chat. But something about it was off. It was overly polite, strangely detached, far too formal to be from someone who typically texted with emojis, nicknames, and little bursts of humor. Her sister-in-law stared at the screen, unsettled by what she was reading. The phrasing didn't sound like Marta. The tone was flat, mechanical. It lacked Marta's spark, the very thing that made her messages feel like a digital hug. She couldn't explain it exactly, but something in her gut told her that Marta hadn't written that message at all. And in that moment, her mind went to one person: Pavel. Pavel Chmielewski, Marta's ex-partner, had been part of the family's concern for a long time. There had been tension, emotional distance, a history that never sat quite right, especially in the last few months, as Marta had tried, carefully, cautiously, to separate from the relationship. Pavel, however, hadn't made that process easy. Fearing the worst and acting on instinct, Marta's sister-in-law drove to Pavel's residence on Wood Street. A quiet, modest room in a neighborhood that once felt unremarkable, even safe. But now even the air seemed different. Still, suspicious. Investigators pressed him during interviews. They asked about Marta's final weekend, about the delay in communication, about the eerie message sent from her phone, about why he hadn't contacted anyone. But Pavel gave them nothing, not even a word. That silence was, in some ways, one of the most disturbing elements of the entire investigation. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it might have hidden. Detectives worked tirelessly to reconstruct a timeline. Marta had last been seen alive on Friday evening, October 15th. From that moment onward, there were no further sightings, no public appearances, no check-ins, no calls. Just only that one deeply unsettling text message sent from her phone that had raised every red flag for her family. That text, oddly formal and missing Marta's usual warmth, became a central clue. It suggested something many feared but few wanted to say out loud, that someone else may have sent it in her place. The text wasn't just suspicious, it was strategic. Marta's brother and sister-in-law were overcome with grief. In hindsight, they acknowledged that Marta had done everything she could to distance herself from Pavel. They had urged her to stay away from him. She had made plans, found new love, and was working toward a future free of fear. Yet no one could have predicted the extent of Pavel's emotional collapse, nor the dangerous path his obsession would take. The investigation soon shifted from concern to confirmation as evidence began to mount. The breakthrough came through hard, digital facts. Security camera footage, digital forensics, and the chilling misuse of Marta's phone. These elements became the foundation of a case that would expose the deeply disturbing actions leading up to Marta's final moments. Northamptonshire police meticulously reviewed surveillance footage from the area surrounding Pavel's residence. Cameras from nearby homes, public streets, and local businesses were pulled for analysis. Among them were critical clips from October 15, the night Marta was last seen. That evening, Marta appeared to radiate a quiet, heartfelt happiness, the kind that only blossoms in the presence of true comfort and trusted companionship. Her smile was soft, almost reflective, as she lounged on the well-worn sofa in Daria's apartment in Woodland Court. It was a familiar space, warmly lit and cozy, filled with little signs of shared memories, photos on the fridge, mismatched cushions, and the gentle background hum of evening television. Marta had spent many evenings here before. It was a kind of refuge, a place where she could simply be herself without judgment or pressure. On this particular night, she was especially at ease. She and Daria were catching up, something that had become a treasured ritual between them. They picked at leftovers, some pasta, a few spring rolls from the night before, while their phones buzzed occasionally beside them. The conversation meandered from workplace gossip to plans for spring, to dreams of travel and new possibilities. The season's arrival brought with it the idea of change, of renewal, and Marta welcomed it with open arms. Her laugh, easy and genuine, echoed in the small apartment. Marta's phone lit up more than usual that night. But these notifications weren't stressful. They weren't about work or family obligations. Instead, they came from Alexandra, a colleague with whom Marta had recently discovered something unexpected, something tender. Their connection had started out as a series of shared glances in the office, then casual texts, and now had grown into something deeper. Their exchanges were playful, affectionate, filled with inside jokes and subtle suggestions of a new, exciting chapter ahead. Yet, beneath this budding happiness, a shadow lingered, one that Marta could not entirely shake off. Her former partner, Pavel, had been contacting her with increasing frequency. Despite her repeated requests to be left alone, he continued to send her messages, one after the other, each one more pressing than the last. That evening, while she was trying to enjoy her time with Daria, he sent yet another series of texts. He asked her to come over. He wanted to see her, and curiously, he had a specific request. He asked her to bring pizza. Just the day before, Marta had made her stance painfully clear. She had told Pavel in no uncertain terms that their relationship was over, that she wanted distance and closure. She deserved peace. But Pavel was not listening. He persisted. And when direct messages didn't seem to be enough, he reached out to a mutual friend, subtly prying for information. When he discovered that Marta was at Daria's apartment that night, it was as though something clicked for him. A switch flipped. He now knew exactly where to find her. At 10:42 p.m., Marta gathered her things, said goodbye to Daria with a warm hug and a promise to text when she got home, and stepped out into the cool night air. The streets were quiet, the kind of stillness that belongs only to small towns at night. She walked with ease, her pace relaxed, her bag swinging lightly against her hip. Security footage from the neighborhood would later show her walking confidently down Wood Street, heading toward Rockingham Road, her silhouette outlined by streetlights. There was no indication of fear or unease, but just 3 minutes later, at 10:45 p.m., another figure emerged on camera. Pavel was seen leaving his rented room on Wood Street. Unlike Marta, he didn't linger or stroll. His walk was direct, determined. Surveillance would later trace his route toward Bath Road, a path that investigators would later believe was a deliberate attempt to intercept her. This wasn't coincidence. It was premeditated movement. At 10:56 p.m., both Marta and Pavel were recorded returning to his residence. They entered together, stepping through the narrow doorway of the shared housing unit. That footage would become a grim milestone, the last visual confirmation of Marta alive, her presence documented not by friends or family, but by a silent, unblinking security camera. What happened next would remain largely sealed behind closed doors. No neighbors reported hearing anything unusual, no loud noises, no calls for help. But digital traces began to reveal fragments of what might have occurred. At approximately 11 p.m., only minutes after they had entered, a photo was taken using Marta's phone. The timestamp was precise. Investigators would later suspect that this image was not innocent. It may have been used to manipulate perception, to create a misleading timeline. Then, around 12:30 a.m. on October 16th, roughly 90 minutes later, Pavel was again interacting with Marta's phone. This time, he was digging deeper. Screenshots were taken of private messages between Marta and Alexandra. For someone harboring unresolved feelings and emotional volatility, these messages would have struck a powerful chord. Investigators would later determine that Pavel's actions during this time weren't impulsive. They were calculated. He was cataloging evidence of her moving on. As the hours passed, a disturbing pattern began to take shape. Pavel began sending messages from Marta's phone, attempting to mimic her voice. These weren't heartfelt or natural. They were off-key. One message to Marta's family in particular stood out. It lacked her usual warmth. It was oddly formal, rigid, like someone trying too hard to imitate someone else. Her family noticed immediately. They sensed something was wrong. Deeply wrong. In the time that followed, Pavel continued this ruse. He messaged friends, reached out to acquaintances, even responded to Alexandra with vague reassurances. He was pretending that Marta was simply busy, just lying low, nothing to worry about. But underneath it all was a chilling reality, one that none of them yet fully understood. The following day, he kept up the act. He sent additional texts. He even used Marta's phone to communicate with men in her contacts list. Casual messages designed to maintain the illusion that she was still out in the world, alive and social. These digital impersonations were not the panicked work of someone who had made a terrible mistake. They were deliberate attempts to delay discovery, to control the narrative, to buy time. By the morning of October 17, 2021, just 2 days after Marta Chmielewski's life had come to a tragic and premature end, Pavel Chmielewski was seen on local CCTV footage, calmly walking to a corner shop not far from his rented room. There was no visible distress, no signs of emotional breakdown. The footage showed him purchasing 6 cans of beer and a single soft drink before casually returning to the very room where Marta remained. His demeanor was eerily normal, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. To the outside world, it was just another man going about his day in the quiet town of Kettering. But behind that everyday exterior was a haunting reality. This surveillance footage would later become a pivotal element in a case that shook the local community and made headlines across Northamptonshire and beyond. Prosecutors described Pavel's behavior in those days not as confused or panicked, but as calculating and cold. His motive, they said, was clear and deeply rooted in toxic jealousy and an inability to accept that Marta had moved on. Witnesses and friends testified that Pavel had told people he couldn't bear the idea of anyone else being close to her, an obsessive thought that escalated into a final, irreversible act of control. The legal proceedings moved forward swiftly once the investigation concluded. By March 3, 2022, Pavel Chmielewski stood before Northampton Crown Court and formally entered a guilty plea to the charge of murdering Marta. There would be no long, drawn-out trial. His admission meant the prosecution would not need to present every gruesome detail in court, and Marta's family would be spared the trauma of reliving the loss through cross-examinations and witness statements. Still, a sentencing hearing was scheduled for September 6, 2023. The courtroom that day was heavy with emotion. Journalists, members of the public, and law enforcement officials gathered to witness the culmination of a painful journey for Marta's loved ones. The case had drawn significant attention, not only for the brutality of the crime, but for the emotional weight it carried within the community. Marta's brother and sister-in-law were present, seated quietly among the crowd. Their faces, etched with months of grief, told a story of deep loss that words could barely express. As part of the proceedings, a family statement was prepared and read aloud in court. A tribute to the woman they had loved so dearly, and a reflection on the devastating void left behind. Marta was exceptional. She was full of life. She was kind, cheerful, helpful, and smart. You never had to ask her for help. She was always just there for us, whatever we needed. She loved our children and was a fantastic auntie to them both. Marta was definitely a daddy's girl too. They had such a bond and such a loving relationship. After her death, her father began stuttering and now finds it very hard to communicate at all. He has really suffered, as have we all. Marta had so many plans and dreams. She was independent and confident, and we loved her so much. It's never going to be the same without her. Losing Marta has changed our whole lives. Their words moved many in the courtroom to tears. It was more than an impact statement. It was a portrait of a woman who had meant everything to her family, a reminder of the life that was taken, not just the circumstances around it. During the hearing, prosecutors meticulously outlined the case against Pavel. They argued that what happened in that Wood Street room was not a spontaneous eruption of emotion, but a deliberate act built on months, if not years, of possessive behavior. The prosecution cited several prior incidents, all documented in court records. One in August 2020, another around Easter in 2021, and a third in September 2021, each illustrating Pavel's escalating aggression and refusal to accept boundaries. This was not a sudden loss of control, the prosecutor told the court. It was the culmination of a disturbing pattern of emotional manipulation, surveillance, and control. Judge David Herbert, who presided over the case, echoed that perspective in his sentencing remarks. He emphasized the enduring trauma left in her family's lives. It was a ferocious and selfish act, one that has left an unfillable hole in the lives of those who loved her, Judge Herbert said. The court also considered Pavel's behavior in the days following the crime. Not only did he remain in the same room with Marta for nearly 4 days, but he attempted to deceive family and friends by using her phone to send misleading messages. He made deliberate efforts to delay discovery, all while portraying himself to the outside world as unaffected. This, the prosecution emphasized, demonstrated a disturbing lack of remorse. When Pavel was finally interviewed, he showed no willingness to explain his actions. Instead, he remained silent, avoiding responsibility even as the evidence became overwhelming. The prosecution argued that this refusal to cooperate was another act of control, an attempt to shape the legal process in his favor. The defense, representing the 40-year-old Pavel with the assistance of a court-appointed interpreter, admitted there was little ground to defend. They acknowledged the horror of the crime, emphasizing that Pavel had entered a guilty plea and had not forced a trial. This, they said, should be seen as a small gesture of accountability. The defense argued that Pavel's actions were driven by intense emotional breakdown and personal crisis, claiming the act had not been premeditated in the legal sense, though they stopped short of asking for sympathy. Despite their efforts, these arguments rang hollow against the weight of the prosecution's timeline, the CCTV footage, the digital evidence, and the haunting silence Pavel had maintained since the day of Marta's death. Finally, after reviewing all arguments, Judge Herbert delivered the sentence. On September 6, 2023, Pavel Chmielewski was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 18 years and 4 months before he would even be eligible to apply for parole.